Hi, my name is Roger, and I'm a pouter. So, all right, you've heard me admit it. I'm a pouter. You know, we know what a pouter is, somebody who pouts. When we see it in a little child, we know how that lip gets pooched out. We know sometimes how that can lead them to throw a little tantrum and that kind of thing. And then after their tantrum, if they're not getting their way, they pout. And that's what pouting is. It's what we do when we don't get our way. Sometimes we'll excuse it for a little child, but it doesn't look very good on us adults. But I'm going to have to admit, I pout. You know, there are times when I read a devotional, and it just really kind of steps on my toes. And what led to these thoughts this morning and this confession of mine was a devotional called Wednesday's Word that is written each week by Paul David Tripp. And that's what he was talking about today. He was talking about pouting. He's been writing some devotionals here lately out of the book of Jonah and on the story of Jonah and about the man Jonah. And he says Jonah was the pouting prophet. Jonah pouted. He said, he pouted about Nineveh. He pouted about the weather. He pouted about where God had him in life. I see it in the church all the time. People don't get their way, and then they pout. But what should we do when it comes to that? Paul wrote to the church at Philippi, and in chapter 2 of the book of Philippians, he talked about the humility of Jesus. He talked about how his humility led him to become obedient in all things, even to death on a cross. And it begins by saying our attitude should be just like the attitude of Jesus. A little bit later on in Philippians, Paul addresses our tendency towards complaining and grumbling. If you've been in the church very long at all, you know that goes on. You know that people get displeased with things, and then they begin to complain, and they begin to grumble, and sometimes they add gossip to that, and then gossip leads to division, and it's just a never-ending cycle, it seems. But the Apostle Paul, when he wrote this letter to the Philippian church, he talked about the complaining and grumbling in the context of working out our salvation. Now, working out our salvation isn't a reference to somehow we have to work to earn our salvation. Salvation is a free gift. Eternal life is the free gift of God. It is by grace we have been saved. It is not by works, so that no man would end up boasting. But he says we're to work out our salvation. In other words, we're to continually be being available to God to conform us and transform us by the renewing of our mind and by His Word. And He uses the church and He uses circumstances and situations to do that all the time. And here's what He says to the church at Philippi. He says, "Therefore, my dear friends," this is in verse 12, "as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God," listen to this, "for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to His good purpose." The transforming work of Christ is going on inside of us. But that should be transforming and conforming the outside of us as well. So he goes on, he says, "Do everything without complaining or grumbling, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a crooked and a depraved generation." Well, it seems like almost every adult I know has a time where they pout, a time where they feel sorry for themselves, or they don't get their way and they grumble or they complain. And yet God is calling us to a different life that doesn't look like the world. And so my encouragement to you as you and I go over the hump today is to do everything that we do. Our relationships in our family, our relationships with our spouse if we're married, our relationships with our children if we have children, even if they're adult children, our relationships with our friends, and our relationships in the church and the work of the ministry, to do all things without complaining or grumbling. That's the kind of mature, healthy, biblical adult we should be. My prayer for myself is that I would quickly recognize those times when I'm tempted to pout over something, and instead humble myself before the Lord, become obedient to Him, and let the glory of Christ be lived out in my life daily. Have a great Wednesday. Have a great week as you go over the hump.